is Mohammad, Heiranian, working with Dr. Aluru. He's going to talk about single layer MoS2 Nanopores as a power generator. Please welcome the speaker.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk about generating power, electricity using a 2D material, a single layer molybdenum disulfide membrane. So for this work, this work was done with experimental collaborators in EPFL, and we did the computational part. So what we did was mainly molecular dynamics simulations. So the systems involved almost 500,000 atoms, and because we will see later on, some of the simulations are based on diffusion. We had to run them for a long period of time, so we required, a very powerful computational resource. So one thing that is very unique about Blue Waters is the high memory that it has, and that's very useful when we are doing calculations and where we need to use read and write files to actually post-process the data. So let me just get into the introduction and background about the problem that we are looking at. So power, electricity basically can be generated from a salt concentration gradient. So one example in the real world would be the concentration gradient that exists between seawater and river, say ocean and river. And then if we have charged nanoporous membranes, then those membranes, the nanopores in those membranes are selective to the counter ions. So let's say if it's negatively charged, then the cations will be absorbed to the surface of the nanopore. So it's more selective to the counter ions. So because of that selectivity, we have more counter ions diffusing down the gradient, and that results in a net current, and we can get electricity out of that. And the corresponding potential, which is called the diffusion potentials, can be obtained from that expression, where we have S is the selectivity factor, and then we have the and it's also a function of the concentration in the concentrated, high concentrated region, and also the low concentrated region. And previously, Bokeh, in his paper in 2013, showed that if we use boron nitride nanotube, which was in the order of microns, and because it's negatively charged on the surface, depending on the pH that we have in the system, we can generate electricity. But now we know that flux scales inversely with the thickness of the membrane. So now if we go from micrometer to nanometer, we should expect much higher current. So that was basically the idea and motivation that we had behind this problem. And about MoS2, its thickness is almost less than 1 nanometer, so it's it's very comparable to graphene. So it's just 3 layers of atoms. And also, in the experiment, it was shown that if we change the pH, we can get charge densities at the nanopore from -1 to -9 electron per nanometer squared. So we have selectivity and the thickness, and then our question is, if we look at the literature for different membranes, polymetric membranes, and also this boron nitride nanotube that I showed in the last slide, what would be the power that we can get, power density that we can get out of molybdenum disulfide? So we did both experiment and simulations. So here we have the experimental results, the IV curve basically. So we have the current as a function of voltage, and as you can see, at 0 voltage we have the short circuit current, and at 0 current we have the open circuit voltage, which is a signature of, you know, selectivity that we have in the system, and that could result in generating power. So we could reproduce the results here for different concentration ratios, as you can see, and so the data points that we have at 0 current was really tricky to get because it's a diffusion-based process. There's no electric field in the system, so we had to run it for a long time so that we could get a reasonable result, and that required, you know, computational resources. And the first thing that we looked at was to characterize the selectivity in the system, because in experiment they cannot really go deep into the system, and then at the nanopore at nanoscale, and, you know, confirm that we have some selectivity in the system. So here we define the potassium selectivity as a you know, in this expression where we have the flux of potassium and the flux of chloride, and if we look at different concentration ratios, 10, 100, and 2000, we see that we have almost 60 to 70% potassium selectivity in the system, and also we can see the same thing if we plot the concentration or in molar as a function of the distance from the center of the pore. So here is the wall, is the wall of the nanopore, and here in the middle is the centroid. So as you can see, there's a double layer, you know, next to the charge wall, and which is occupied by the Cantor ions, and that's also, you know, showing that we have a very large selectivity. If you look at the values here, 6 molar compared to the ones for the coions, we have a very large selectivity in this nanopore. Also, we looked at the open circuit voltage and short circuit current as a function of the concentration ratio. So these two plots are from experiments, and down here we have the molecular dynamics results. And one thing that is not you know, very obvious if we look at it at first is this non-monotonic behavior that we have for the short circuit currents, that is that we observe both in experiments and simulation. So to explain that, we decompose the component of the current to diffusion and migration of ions. And what we found was that when we increase the concentration ratio in this plot, so we have different components of currents here, we see that the when you increase that concentration ratio, the migration effect contributes more to the current, and that actually suppresses the total current. So that's why it starts to, you know, it has this non-monotonic behavior. So it doesn't increase forever with the concentration ratio. Also, in experiments, we saw that this open circuit voltage with pore size, if we plot it again, we have this, it's in blue, we have this behavior. So we wanted to also explain this, and we found that in our simulations that this is because as we increase the size of the pore, the nanopore, we lose the selectivity of the system, and then the current, I mean the diffusion due to potassium and chloride kind of balance each other. So we reach, eventually we will reach to almost zero current. And finally, we looked at this most important thing about this 2D material, which is the effect of the thickness. I mean, why that is very unique in our system. So we looked at the, in MD simulations, we looked at the IV curve, the current and voltage for a symmetric concentration of potassium chloride. So there's no concentration gradient here. And then out of this, for different layers of the membranes, we got the conductance as a function of 1 over L, or 1 over the thickness. And we noticed that, this is not linear. So classically, the only thing that we are changing is the length or the thickness of the membrane. So that, classically speaking, that should actually behave linearly. But there's something else is actually playing at this scale, and that is the mobility of the ions. So if we look at the mobility of potassium and chloride separately as a function of number of layers, we see that there's a very huge reduction as we go from 1 layer to 2 or 3 layers of molybdenum in the mobility of these ions. And if we look at this more carefully, we see that if we have the concentration as a function of, again, distance from the center of the pore, we have this double layer of Cantor ions. And then these guys actually get absorbed to the surface of the membrane. And that's evident from the residence time of these potassium chloride within lambda, the double layer. So imagine if we have a 1 layer molybdenum, then that time is 0.08 nanosecond. But just adding 11 more layers, that's more than 15 nanoseconds. So that is really, the advantage of a 2D material, a single layer MoS2 over, larger systems. So it's a very unique membrane. So now if we look at the power and its relationship with the thickness, we know that the maximum power is proportional to both conductance and the square of the open circuit voltage. So in the previous slide, we have the conductance here for different layers of membranes, and and here we have the open circuit voltage for different layers, and then we can plot the ratio of the maximum power normalized by the power of the maximum power of a single layer membrane. And as you can see, going from single layer to a 12 layer membrane, the power that we get for that 12 layer membrane is only 3% of that we get for a single layer membrane. So that explains why we got 1 million watt per meter squared of power density using this single layer membrane. So this is very outstanding, and our paper was published in Nature last year, and just because we were able to, change this power density I mean that we were able to change the order of magnitude of this power density from, you know, like 1,000 to 1 million watt per meter squared of, you know, the membrane. So in conclusion, we showed that, you know, MoS2 membranes are very promising to get electricity, you know, out of salt concentration gradient, and that's a giant power, 10 to 6 watt per meter squared of the membrane, and that's the reason behind that is the thinness of this molybdenum disulfide, which makes it very unique. And also we observed that, you know, addition to the length effect, the ion mobility decreases substantially with the length of the membranes. And we also, using our simulations, we were able to explain some of the behavior that wasn't really obvious at first in experiments, like the non-monotonic behavior of the short circuit current with the concentration ratio. So here I want to thank Blue Waters, because without Blue Waters we weren't able to, you know, do these simulations, and yeah. Thanks for your attention.